Mark, in the last segment, you mentioned some concerns you had about political hypocrisy. And there are politicians who have supported these truck protests. And as you said, they opposed rail blockades. The hypocrisy seems to be going both ways, from conservative politicians and from liberal or progressive politicians. Now, maybe you can give me some examples of that, but more broadly, do you think that there's a tendency for people, and especially politicians, to tolerate or even encourage protests that they're in favor of, but want to shut down the protests for causes they oppose?
Yeah, this is a very disturbing question, Christine. And I mean, there are many examples of this on all sides. It's really not a one side only problem. I could think of the man who wants to be the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre, who waxed poetically about the rule of law in relation to the Indigenous blockades, but still hasn't, as far as I know, come out to call for the end of the blockades of the borders. Premier Moe in Saskatchewan, similar problem. On the other side, of course, Ryan mentioned the Liberal Party's approach to protests and how it's inconsistent between two similar blockades here. And to your second question, I think this trend does exist. There are politicians that are willing to encourage protests that are very similar in nature as long as the cause aligns with theirs. And for the ones that don't, they're going to be stay quiet or shirk away from the responsibility. And like I said in my piece on the line, under these conditions, we don't really have a rule of law society. We have a rule of something else, perhaps rule of political preference or rule of whatever causes a politician thinks is best, but it's not equal application of the law. And it's very concerning to see this.
Now, I mean, my view is that the level of disruption by the truck protest in Ottawa, especially at the beginning, can really be differentiated from rail blockades or the border blockades that we're now seeing. A protest in Ottawa, even a noisy one that blocks traffic, is fairly standard practice. And as much as some lobbyists might claim otherwise, Spark Street is not critical infrastructure. But now, as the protest is beginning to block that critical infrastructure, highways and bridges and border crossings, I do think there's a really pretty direct comparison to those rail blockades we saw a year ago. And those went on for a really long time, too. So, Ryan, I want to ask you the same question. Do you think we're at a level where there's some political hypocrisy? Is there media hypocrisy? Is the media covering these types of protests in a really different way? What's your view on that?
I think we saw in February 2020, the coverage of the rail blockades from legacy media was oftentimes very sympathetic, referring to protesters, for example, using different terms such as land defenders, et cetera. And those are rhetorical flourishes that speak to the perspective of those reporting, whereas you saw independent media covering those protests and asking for police intervention, for injunctions to actually be enforced, et cetera. The opposite is now the case, where we're seeing the legacy media, call for, in some cases, military intervention, police intervention for the protests in Ottawa and also at the border, and then the opposite from the independent media. So there's really been no consistency in the approach that I've seen from the media, nor, to Mark's points and the point I made earlier, from the politicians. Everyone sees what they want to see in a protest. But I think we do need to make the distinction between the protest in Ottawa and the protest at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor. We're hearing liberal politicians, progressive politicians call the protest in Ottawa blockade, referring to the same thing in terms of Windsor. Preventing access to critical infrastructure is a blockade and not to be dealt with by way of the rule of law, through court injunctions, actions, et cetera. But exercising your constitutional right to protest in the parliamentary precinct, the seat of our democracy, is entirely different. And we're seeing politicians, liberal and progressive, saying that that's a blockade. It's not appropriate, completely ignoring the constitutional right to do so when it's not a blockade because critical infrastructure is not being involved.
Mark, I want to just give you an opportunity to respond to that briefly.
I think, again, these are two. I agree that the protest in Ottawa as of last Saturday, is a different beast than what we have now. I think what we have now is a much more concerning prospect because of the failure of the Ottawa police to sort of contain this like they did in other cities. this has spread now to the point where it's now out of control, and now we're left with very, very bad options in terms of how to stop this. We have different powers perhaps being exercised, but this is a tough situation now that has grown out of this.